A few days ago, I stumbled upon a forum where people share the darkest moments of their lives. This is the story of an ordinary guy who just wanted to take his career as an IT specialist to the next level. He thought he could earn more and finally reach the level of life he had always dreamed of. But his decision plunged him into the shadowy world of cybercrime, where one wrong step leads to a trap from which there seems to be no escape. Today I want to tell you this story. A story that began as a simple desire to find a better job, but turned into a real struggle for survival. It will be a warning to anyone who has ever thought for even a moment about choosing easy money in exchange for their freedom. Ready to dive into the hidden depths of the cyber world? Then let's begin. When I decided to become a freelancer and work remotely, I had no idea where it would lead. My story began like many others, looking for new opportunities when old plans stop working and you are left at a crossroads. At the time, I had been working in programming for several years, but my career remained in the same place, with no significant progress. There was a lot of work, but it paid a pittance, and the projects I was doing were monotonous and did not allow me to grow professionally. I was living in the suburbs of Chicago, dreaming of success, but the reality was much more prosaic. A lot of student loan debt, rent bills, constant stress about making ends meet every month. Every day I spent hours commuting to work, and in the evenings, sitting in my small apartment, I felt that my potential was simply disappearing into the routine. I wanted more, financial stability and the opportunity to develop. I realized that this situation could not last forever, and I had to change something. One evening, while flipping through forums, I came across an interesting topic: remote work on shadow markets. At first I was hesitant, but then I realized that it paid several times more. The idea that I could work from home and earn a much higher income at the same time seemed attractive. All I had to do was find the right clients. I wasn't naive. I knew that most of the tasks were not entirely legal, but I thought I could just do the technical tasks and not look into their application. I thought that this way I could distance myself from any responsibility for how my developments would be used. Soon I took the plunge and registered on one of the forums where it was said that I could find clients who were willing to pay big money for programming skills. At first I felt a bit unsure, but I quickly realized that the demand for programming services in this area was huge. I started offering my programming services and soon received my first orders. The first tasks I received were quite simple: automating certain tasks, developing small scripts for data collection. They paid well, so I didn't ask too many questions. The money started coming in, and I was relieved that I could finally cover my expenses and maybe even save some for the future. It seemed like the perfect option. I was working for myself, free from the office routine, and earning a good income at the same time. But that all changed when one day a client with the nickname Blackhound wrote to me and asked me to develop a bot for collecting contacts. He needed something that could scan social networks and extract people's profiles and contacts. The terms sounded serious, and the amount he offered was impressive. I decided to take a chance because this money could be the beginning of a new stage in my life. When I finished working on the bot, Blackhound transferred the payment to an anonymous wallet. Everything was surprisingly simple, and I was already getting used to this new area. I thought I was just providing a service. How many programmers work with data? But each time, the customer's requirements became more complex and questionable from the point of view of legality. A few months later, the same Blackhound contacted me again. This time he had a different task: to develop a vulnerability scanner. This was a completely different level. It was about creating a tool that could help hack into the databases of small companies that stored customer information on insecure systems. I understood that this was a serious matter, but when I was offered an amount of $50,000, which was hard to refuse, I again convinced myself that it was just a tool and that it was not my responsibility to use it. So I started working on it. A month later, I handed over the finished scanner and received payment. The thought of what I had developed tormented me for several days. However, I decided not to dwell on it and continue working. Over the next few months, I continued to work on various tasks for other customers. They were simple automation or data collection projects that seemed safe enough. The money came in regularly, and I was already feeling more confident in this new area. But one morning, my boss called me. She told me a story about her data being leaked. She wanted me to help her and tell her what to do in such a situation. At first, I wasn't 100% sure that it had anything to do with my work, but some of the details matched what I was working on. I broke out in a cold sweat when I realized that maybe it was the results of my work. It was already extremely serious. I began to realize that I was getting involved in something that could have unpredictable consequences. But at that moment, I made the biggest mistake of all. I agreed. The first money I earned gave me a sense of confidence that quickly turned into an addiction. I needed money, and I convinced myself that if I didn't do it, someone else would. However, a few weeks later, I was contacted by Blackhound again and asked to develop a script that could bypass payment systems. This task was much more complicated, so I tried to refuse, explaining that the script would only be able to bypass payment systems on certain marketplaces with weak security, not all systems in general. However, Blackhound offered me more than $500,000 for this script. Tell me, who would have turned it down? After completing work on a script to bypass payment systems, I again received what seemed at the time to be an unrealistic amount of money. The script was a sophisticated piece of software that allowed attackers to bypass payment system security, including transaction security checks on certain websites. Its main function was to analyze vulnerabilities and exploit loopholes in the software code to make fraudulent transactions. Everything seemed to be working as it should, and no one was paying attention. But a few weeks later, the situation changed. I started receiving messages from other customers offering more and more dangerous tasks. It was no longer possible to refuse. I realized that my services were needed not just by individual hackers, but by entire organized cybercrime groups. One evening, I received a message from Blackhound that was different from all the previous ones. This time, it didn't even ask for a task. The message was clear and disturbing. "We own you now, and don't you dare refuse." At that moment, I realized that there was no way out. They knew more about me than I thought: my real name, my place of residence, even the contacts of my friends and family. I was trapped. I tried to convince them that I wanted to take a break. But they only threatened to tell my immediate family what I had done, and even worse, they hinted at the police. I realized that I had no choice. Now I worked for them without question, performing tasks I would never have considered before. I developed tools for hacking bank accounts, helped to bypass the security systems of large platforms, and always received payment in cryptocurrency. But more and more I felt that I was sinking into a swamp from which there was no way out. It was no longer just money. I found myself in the heart of a shadowy world that was difficult to escape. Every day I lived in fear that I would be exposed, or worse, that these people would not give me a single chance to get out of the game. My freedom was only an illusion, and I was constantly thinking about how to find a way out. But it seemed that every step I took only led me further into a trap from which there was no escape. Over time, I began to realize that the only chance I had to escape this nightmare was to find a way to stop being useful to them. I began to notice that the more information I had, the more they controlled me. I decided to tread carefully and try to find allies who could help me get out of this situation. I started to look for information about people who had already been through similar situations and managed to leave the criminal world behind. It was hard to find such people, but a few months later I came across a former hacker who had been in a similar situation. He told me his story and gave me some advice on how to proceed. He explained that the only chance I had to save myself was to find a way to ensure that they lost interest in me. Instead of just trying to run away, I had to make myself unprofitable and unnecessary for them. This approach took time, but it was the only chance I had of being saved. I started to deliberately reduce the effectiveness of my work by adding errors to my software solutions that were hard to notice, but had a significant impact on the results. I designed the code so that it would have random crashes that could look like technical flaws rather than deliberate actions. I also tried to spend more time on tasks, which affected productivity and reduced my value as a performer. I also started to use my time to create evidence that could show that I was forced to work for these groups under threat. Screenshots of messages, copies of correspondence that indicated intimidation and extortion. I also adjusted my actions to make my work processes look like they were done under duress, leaving clear traces of interference from the customers. All of this required a lot of effort and great care, but I realized that any chance for freedom was worth it. Many months passed before I started to notice the changes. They started to ask me for new tasks less often, and I became less reliable. It was a signal that my plan was starting to work. But at the same time, it gave me mixed feelings. I was relieved, but at the same time, I felt responsible for my actions and for getting involved in the criminal world. Every day I thought about how I could have chosen a different path, not gotten involved in these dangerous adventures. I was constantly tormented by the thought of how much harm my actions could have caused people, and I realized that I was involved in something much more serious than I could have imagined. This sense of responsibility pushed me to do everything I could to reduce the damage I had already done and gradually find a way out. I was also not ready to go to prison, but I felt that I could not allow this criminal group to continue. So I started collecting evidence, doing it carefully and thoughtfully, so that the evidence would show that I was forced to act under pressure. I collected screenshots of messages, copies of correspondence indicating intimidation and extortion, and did everything to create the impression of coercion. My goal was to go to the police and expose this criminal organization, but to do so in a way that would not make me a victim of my own mistakes. I realized that, without the support of law enforcement, my chances of safety were minimal, so I decided to go to the police and negotiate cooperation. I explained to them that I was ready to provide all the evidence I had been collecting for many months and expose the organization, but I also clearly expressed my concern for my life and the safety of my family, so I insisted on receiving police protection. My cooperation with the police was only the beginning. After the first meetings, it became clear that the case was much more serious than I thought. The moment I handed over the evidence I had collected to the police, they began to coordinate the investigation at a higher level. A few days later, I received a phone call with the news that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Cybercrime Division, was involved in the case. The first contact with FBI agents did not go exactly as I expected. Two serious men in strict suits came to the meeting at the police office and introduced themselves as Agents Johnson and Carter. Under their gaze, I felt that the conversation would be far from friendly. They started with a direct question: why did you decide to come to us in the first place? Their doubts were understandable. The agents needed concrete proof of my honesty so that they could guarantee protection. After a few minutes of interrogation, they forced me to lay out all the way back to that point. From the first tasks that seemed safe, to increasingly serious violations, and eventually to the script to bypass payment systems. They asked clear and specific questions, making sure I could provide important details about the group I was working with, including all known contacts, names, nicknames, and platforms. When I was done, Agent Johnson finally said, "This is much more serious than you realize. We have evidence that your activities may have been part of a global network of cybercriminals, and if you help us, we can track down the organizers. But we'll need your full cooperation, and that could take a long time. Instead of defense, we are offering you a deal. We guarantee a suspended sentence and help in protecting your family. But for this, you must provide us with full information about all the steps of the organization and even continue to have contact with it under our control." I realized that there was no easy way out. They offered me to agree to become part of an undercover operation, an agent who would actually continue to work for the organization, but now under the supervision of FBI agents. It was hard not to agree. They made it clear that either I would cooperate or the case would go to court, where they would present all the evidence that could prove my involvement in cybercrime. A few days after this conversation, I decided to ask Blackhound to provide me with more work for serious amounts of money. I realized that the more involved I was, the better chance the FBI would have of obtaining new evidence. I wrote to him that I was willing to take on risky assignments to earn significant amounts of money, and I tried to make it look like my ambitions had grown, and with them, my desire to earn more. Blackhound did not immediately agree, but after a few days of negotiations, he started sending me tasks that involved even more work, and consequently, more risks. The next few weeks were a real test for me. Under the guidance of the agents, I stayed in touch with my contacts, received new assignments, and completed them without the criminals suspecting that I was now working with the FBI. At every stage, before handing over any new code or tool, I would inform the agents, and they would check every line of code, inserting traps for cybercriminals. The FBI would also install tracking code that would help them identify each user who downloaded my software. The feds were monitoring everything I did. I received every new message from Blackhound through a special program that the agents installed for tracking. We studied all its instructions and developed tactics to ensure further penetration of the network. With the help of the FBI, I also provided Blackhound with several faulty programs with built-in vulnerabilities so that they could later track the criminals through these loopholes. Everything was going according to plan until Blackhound started to suspect something was amiss. One evening, I received a message from him. "You don't seem the same to me as before. Are you working for someone?" It was the most frightening moment of my time with the FBI. Agent Johnson saw this and quickly instructed me to respond calmly and assure Blackhound that it was business as usual. I sent a pre-prepared message and it thankfully worked. However, after that, they introduced stricter controls over my activities. The following months were a nightmare. The FBI was still hoping that we would get to the other members of the group, and that we would eventually be able to identify where the servers of this cybercrime organization were located. Over time, we learned that it was an international network, and this complicated the whole operation. Many contacts were made through encrypted servers and proxy networks that passed through several countries, which added new challenges for the agents. After almost a year of undercover work, numerous negotiations, and evidence gathering, the FBI was finally ready for the final operation. They had gathered enough information to arrest several key people in the U.S. and use them to track down the international participants in the network. My involvement in the case, according to the agents, was extremely valuable, and they promised to provide me with the opportunity to change my identity and protect me and my family. The Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted a large-scale operation, arresting dozens of cybercriminals who worked for the organization behind all these frauds. I was given the opportunity to start a new life in another city. After the operation was completed, the agents helped me move and create a new identity, but the feeling of constant fear stayed with me for a long time. Eventually, my life began to gradually return to normal. I moved to another city, changed all my contacts, and started a new life with the help of the FBI. Now, looking back, I realize how risky every decision I made was. But I also realize that desperation and the desire for easy money can lure you into situations that can destroy your life. And even when there seems to be no way out, there is always a chance, however small, to change your path. Friends, our story today is coming to an end, but we are not saying goodbye yet. I've prepared 2 more stories for you that might shock you. The first one is also about an IT specialist who lost hope and tried to use his professional skills in a somewhat different field. The second one is about a person who created an entire empire of counterfeit money that spread across America. Choose what to watch next and dive into the world of new discoveries. As for me, I'll go prepare the next episode for you. See you soon.